Welcome also to everyone online. If you're watching online, you might notice that we're in a different spot than usual. No one ever said we weren't adaptable. If you don't know me, I think everyone here knows me, but anyone watching online, if you don't know me, my name is Nicole Clements. I have the privilege of serving on the board of directors here at Refuge Church. I also occasionally lead worship here. And my husband Ryan and I helped start Refuge Church as well. But this is my first time preaching, so bear with me. Hopefully this makes sense to somebody else. Today I'm preaching on a passage from Genesis, which might be a bit of a bold choice considering Ella's our pastor, but I did get some feedback from her, so hopefully we keep the heresy to a minimum. Just kidding, hopefully. So today we're looking at Genesis 16, 7 through 14. And before we get into that, I want to provide a little bit of context. Just before this particular story happens, Avram has just been promised by God that his descendants will be too many to count. God says, go outside, look up at the stars, and just as you can't count the stars, that's how many descendants you will have. But time has passed and his wife Sarai has not become pregnant. The Bible says that she is barren. So Sarai decides to take matters into her own hands, and she sends her servant or slave, Hagar, to Avram so that they can have a child through her. And once Hagar becomes pregnant, it says that she began to despise her mistress, or the word there is the same word used as curse. And we're not really told why she despises or curses Sarai, possibly because she was forced into this situation. She likely didn't really have an option of saying no, but regardless, as a result of that, Sarai begins to mistreat her. And the phrase used for mistreat here indicates an actual physical violence against Hagar. One translation of the word is to afflict or to oppress. The translation Elle sent me is drove her into the ground with labor. So it's this very evocative physical violence against her. In one rabbinic interpretation of the Midrash, Sarai throws her shoes at Hagar as not only a physical abuse towards her, but also kind of a demeaning way of saying you're nothing, you're dirt, I walk on you like the dirt kind of thing. So in the face of all of this, understandably, Hagar runs away. This is where we pick up the story in verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Yishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi, meaning well of the living one who sees me. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So in this story, Hagar has no agency. She has no power over her own body. She's not really given the option of saying no when Sarai gives her to Avram to be used. In her book, Womanist Midrash, Wilda C. Gaffney says that Hagar is on the underside of all of the power curves at play here. Even her name, Hagar, means foreigner or guest or stranger. It's probably not her real name, probably not the name her mother gave her at birth. It's hard to imagine that her mother would name her stranger or foreigner. In the Islamic tradition, which Hagar is very important in the Islamic tradition as well, right? The mother of Ishmael. Her name is Hajar, which means splendid or nourishing. Very different from what we see here. But the name she's called in the text here means essentially outsider. She's seen completely as being an outsider with essentially no inherent worth other than to provide a child for Avram and Sarai. So having no power or agency, she does the only thing she can do. She runs away. And in this place, this is where God meets her. It's unclear what exact form God takes here. In the translation we use today, it says an angel of the Lord, an angel of the Lord. It's very dramatic. But the word used is malach, which is often translated to messenger. Again, in the translation that Elle sent me, she said one full of Yahweh. So whether this is an angel, whether this is a human operating under the Spirit of God, whether this is God himself in disguise, it's not particularly clear, but what is clear is that this is essentially God speaking to Hagar here. And this happens many times throughout the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. God's appearing or speaking to people, but this particular instance is unique. First of all, Hagar is the opposite of the kind of person I think we would normally assume God would reveal himself to. She is a foreigner, she is enslaved, she is an Egyptian, she is a woman. She's on the wrong end of all of the hierarchies, all of them. But God flips this narrative and he shows that he cares deeply for those on the margins, those outsiders, and those on the underside of the power curves, is what the Gaffney says. God meets Hagar, and not only that, but he promises her that her descendants will be too many to count, just like Avram. So it's an essentially identical promise that he has made to Avram just before this, only this time he's making this promise to a woman, an Egyptian enslaved woman at that. God sees Hagar in this moment. She is important to him. Important enough to make an identical promise that he makes to Avram, the father of the faith, right? There's another parallel at play here too. In the same passage where God tells Avram that he will have many descendants, he says, "For 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated here." And the word for mistreated, anah, it's the same word used for how Sarai mistreats Hagar or drives her into the ground with labor, right? Also, Hagar, as I mentioned before, her name means stranger, guest. The word for stranger here, gar, is the same part from her name, Hagar, gar. So beyond the linguistic similarities, there are also narrative similarities. You have, later on in the story, Hagar leaves with Ishmael again, this time for good. They leave and go live in Egypt. And so you have, in this story, Hagar is being oppressed by Sarai and Avram. The Israelites in Egypt are oppressed by the Egyptians. They both flee. They both go into the desert and get lost. There are multiple other similarities. It could be a whole other sermon. I won't go into all of that today. But I wanted to bring it up because I think that there's one takeaway that can kind of relate to this story today. Rabbi David Foreman, who, if you're not familiar with him, is excellent. I highly recommend looking up his work. He explores these parallels in these two stories, the Exodus story and Hagar's story. And he says that the lesson to be learned here is to love the stranger. He argues that this was the sin of Sarai and Avram, that they did not care for, did not love the stranger, the outsider, who was among them, Hagar. And not only that, but they actively oppressed and abused her. This is later the same thing that happens to the Israelites in Egypt. They are not welcomed in as outsiders. They are actually oppressed, abused, and eventually God delivers them out of Egypt, right? So a takeaway from these two stories is, are we loving not just the people immediately around us who look like us, who we get along with, the people that we like that are easy for us to love? Are we also loving the outsiders, the people on the margins, the people who are strangers among us? So back to Hagar. So God meets her at the well. He sees her. He tells her to name her son Yishmael, which means God listens. And then he sends her back to the people who abused her. I really don't like this part of the story. It doesn't feel like justice to me. It's really hard for me to see this, that God says, I hear you, I see you. It says, Yahweh Shema's, you're driven into the ground labor. Shema, that word for listen, is not just, oh, I heard you, I heard what happened. It's like an active listening, a listening that spurs into action. So God is saying, I see you, I see what's happening. And then he sends her right back. I think it would be easier if he rescued her in this moment. For me, it would be easier if he rescued her in this moment, or even just let her keep going. But instead, he says, go back. He literally says, drive yourself into the ground under her hand. He again uses that same word for mistreat, that drive her into the ground, drive yourself into the ground under Sarai's hand. So what can we take away from this? This is, again, kind of hard to hear. Sometimes God is the God who liberates, right? Who brings justice, who delivers us out of difficult situations, but sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes nothing changes for a really long period of time or even ever in our lifetime that we see. But even then, God sees us and he knows us. He sees what we are going through. He sees our misery and it matters to him. Even though he tells her to return, Hagar says, you are the God who sees me. Even though he sent her back and absolutely nothing about her situation changed as far as we can tell in the story. She recognized that God saw her, that he was with her, and that her difficulties and her misery mattered to him. I don't think that it's in a way of like, God is putting you through this trial so that you can come out on the other side stronger and wiser and better. But I think that when we go through difficult times, when we're experiencing misery in our lives, God is saying that He is with us and that He sees us, and that even if we feel invisible, if we feel on the outside, it still matters to Him that we are going through that. The second thing that makes this encounter with God so unique is that Hagar actually names God. There are many different names in the Bible for God. I asked Elle, she said she thought maybe about 30 or so, and they span a wide range of meanings. Yet Hagar is the only person in the whole canon to name God. Not Avram, Yitzhak, or Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, right? Not Moshe, Moses. None of the important figures of the faith name God. Hagar is the only person to name God, a woman, an enslaved person, an outsider. The names that Hagar had known for God didn't encompass this experience that she had with him. And so she gave him a new name that did explain what she was experiencing. I think what we can learn from Hagar is that God is bigger than what we know of him, that he's more than just what we see in the text or what we've been taught. I think if there's a through line between what I mentioned earlier, the parallels between Hagar's story and the Exodus story and this story, it's that God is calling us to love the outsiders and the strangers among us. But then when he doesn't, he's saying, when we don't love the strangers and the outsiders around us, he's saying that that still matters to him. Those people still matter to him. And this name that God gave to Hagar, I think, describes that. Outside of the canon, many different people across many different cultures have given God different names. We're going to sing another song here in a minute, but before we do, I want to do this call and response that I found. This is called An African Invocation of Divine Names by Bongyemege Orobator, who is a Jesuit priest from Nigeria, and he compiled this list of many different names of God, given to God by indigenous peoples in Africa. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to put it up on the screen, and I'm going to read through the names, and then there's a kind of a response in bold at the bottom, and we'll all say that response together. And as you're listening to me read these names for God, I would invite you to consider the image that it conjures for you of God and whether or not this is the God that you feel you've experienced in your life or been taught about.
Ancient deity, unbreakable stone, consoler and comforter providing salvation, grandfather who alone is the great one, watcher of everything who is not surprised by anything, piler of rocks into towering mountains, divider of night and day, we praise you. Sun too bright for our gaze, eye of the sun, artist in chief, drummer of life, owner of our head, large and deep pot, my feathered one, mother of people, bless us. Great nursing mother, great eye, great rainbow, great personal guardian spirit, unsurpassed great spirit, great source of being, great mantle which covers us, great leopard with its own forest, great healer of eternal life, great water giver, great well, greatest of friends, great spider the all-wise one, enlighten us. Controller of destiny in the universe, all-powerful, never defeated, Father of laughter, King without blemish, caller forth of the branching trees, unique great one to whom one can take petitions and requests for counsel, hear us. The first who always existed and will never die, the only one bull in the world, the one who sees both the inside and the outside, the one we meet everywhere, the one who is in all ages, everywhere and at all times, the one who turns things upside down, the one who has power to destroy completely, the one who makes the sun set, the one who gave everything on this earth and can take everything away. Guide us. Axe that fears no thistle, hoe that fears no soil, ram of majestic sinews and majestic carriage, hero who never flees before the enemy, big boundless hut, victory over death, protect us.